Oh, you mean you had a bad dream?
Traveling down the tunnel, Jedediah hears footsteps ahead of them. They're barely faster than the groups. He wants to say something, but he's wondering if he's hearing things. The banging gets louder and louder. Then finally a snap and laughing can be heard. He turns around, aiming Becky, waiting for the others to run off. He breathes and hearing crawling on the dirt walls. One drops down. It's Jenkins, the hole in his head, eyes glowing and evil white. He slowly walks, bones cracking. He keeps a steady aim. Then he hears another drop. Seeing Grady, Jawless, both cackling, he puts his finger on the trigger. Grady lunges forward. Jedediah shoots at his head. Blowing off half of his head, Jenkins floats at him, grabbing his face, slamming his head into the dirt wall. Stopping for a second, Jedediah regains his focuses, seeing Grady rise up, saying,
"If it's any consolation, that hurt like hell."
Jenkins shouts at him.
"Get the gun."
Grady grabs Becky and aims the gun. After hearing a cock, he sees in a flash the gun vanish and the creature as it falls back. Then, in seconds, he feels his hands landing on the dirt floor, spotting Loretta next to him holding Becky. Passed out with her nose bleeding, he understands something happening similar to him before. So he picks up Becky, grabbing Loretta's arm, draping her on his shoulder, and race walks, hearing the creatures screaming. At the other end, the others are screaming as Jennifer catches up. She sees the rest slamming on a wooden door, with the other end saying, "We just saw this door open. We had to close it once we heard the screaming. We can't risk it." Jennifer steps up, shouting,
"Is the elder class there?"
"Maybe. Who specifically?"
"Rod Lane, Alpha Elder."
In seconds, the door opens, showing Rod with a bandage on his left eye next to a tall, dark-skinned man wearing a flannel shirt and blue jeans. Everyone hurries in, but when they are about to shut the door, Jennifer stops them, saying,
"We still have 2 more out in the tunnels."
Rod looks at her and says,
"They'll be remembered, but we can't risk any more people."
Malcolm steps up and says,
"They saved our lives. We aren't leaving them."
Oi!
They turn out, seeing Jedediah carrying Loretta's unconscious body, running with the deadites forms of Grady and Leroy behind them. He hurries in with the others, shutting the door. Grady's half-head blocking it, with him pushing the door, Rod grabbing his axe, cutting at his neck, blood spitting out everywhere. The head rolling on the ground. Rod shouts,
"Someone get that thing to the fireplace. Rest of you help me block this."
Malcolm grabs the head, carrying it as quick as he can to the fireplace. Seconds before reaching it, a voice says,
"Hey!"
He looks around, then hearing his PKE meter going off, he looks down, seeing the head turned at him, the jawless area. In seconds, veins come out, forming together to make a lower jaw with rows of sharp teeth, then clamp down on his left hand. He screams for a second, then slams the head, try to get it off. After it finally rolls away to the fireplace, he kicks it in. As it burns away, he hears it laughing at him for a solid minute, then nothing. He can still hear his PKE going off. He looks down at his hand, seeing black lines forming all around it as it starts moving without his will. Back at the other room, Jedediah sets Loretta on the table, lightly smacking her face.
She isn't waking up. Why isn't she waking up?
Rod tells him,
"I'll take over Reggie. Can you get out medic from upstairs?"
The man with a flannel shirt runs off to go check as Rod tells Jedediah,
"Go sit down, kid. We got it."
Jedediah stands there, not wanting anything to go wrong. Jennifer grabs his arm and says,
"He's got it all right."
The two head out to the living room and sit down, with Jennifer deciding to get his mind on something else.
"Who was the him you spoke of back at the hotel?"
Jedediah thinks on it and says,
Tommy Jarvis. I saw his mask in a newspaper. I read. He's the one that let the Deadites in. He must have opened the doors in the kitchen, waiting to get in unnoticed.
Jedediah stupidly lets it slip.
I had a dream about him.
Jennifer asks,
"Wait, when? I thought you'd been drinking so much you were blacked out."
He realizes what he did, and he thinks for a moment and looks up, saying,
Jennifer,
They start to hear plates smashing. The two get up and head to the source, the kitchen, seeing Malcolm slamming plates on his head, looking at the two, shouting,
Cut it off.
Jedediah looks over, seeing Malcolm's PKE going off. He rushes over to stop the hand. Malcolm's hand stretches out, palm aiming at Jedediah. Then, in seconds, it smacks him back into the wall. Jennifer jumps at his arm from the side, and it swipes her into the cabinets. Malcolm grabs his own hand, only for it to grab his and snap one of his fingers on his right hand. He screams as it grabs his blonde hair and pulls his whole body forward, flipping him on his back. In seconds, the hand pulls his arm up, aiming its fingers around like eyes, spotting Jedediah with a cleaver in front of him. It lands its palm on the ground, using the fingers pulling him forward towards the cleaver to kill Jedediah. As it reaches a few inches away from the cleaver, a knife stabs into Malcolm's hand. Loretta steps back with Rod coming in, with Malcolm looking up, shouting,
Do it.
He swings the axe at the transverse carpal, twice cutting it off. He takes the hand and quickly throws it into the fireplace. As it burns, the PKE meter slowly stops making noise. Jedediah wakes up hearing snaping, seeing Jennifer and Tim over him. Jennifer states he sits up, seeing Malcolm being held by Loretta, his hand holding a stump duct tape to slow the bleeding. He starts to talk to Loretta.
You saved me. The same way I saved her. How'd you do it? You've been sleeping well, and you said that last time you dreamt of Dad was the last time you tried.
She looks up at him and says,
I don't know. You died?
Jedediah looks in shock and says,
In the kitchen?
She sits there as he continues.
The tunnel?
She still sits there as he says,
By the door?
She finally answers,
All of them.
Jedediah sits there and thinks in his head, like the times he tried to save his mom and Jennifer. Malcolm can see he understands. She continues,
Each time I went to bed, I think I felt a powerful urge, and I woke up in a hall. White light coming towards me, and I ran until I saw a picture with a door. I entered, and I was back by the door, and before you were pulled in, I closed the door. Blood spilled out like a large hole. We locked it and ran. Then I slept. Second time I ended up there, I quickly put the crowbar in, and we all ran. I ran all the way to the end, to the door. We got in, but I heard gunshot. Then a body slamming to the wall, then another gunshot. I made it to the door, and then I slept, waking back up in that hallway, seeing the white coming towards me again. So I went back again, this time sticking around till you stayed and shot at those things, but using that stop time thing, it drained me to where I passed out. 2 hours later, Malcolm told me about how his hand was bit and it chopped you up into little pieces. Seconds after, Jennifer cut it off and burned it. Then I went back to sleep again, once more, with that haunting light coming towards me, burning the hallway. And I made it to the image where I was on a table. I woke up and ran into the kitchen seconds before it happened. You think I'm crazy, don't you?
Jedediah shakes his head as Jennifer looks at him and says,
You believe she went back in time to save your life?
He looks at her and says,
Why shouldn't I? I used to have that gift, but I lost it when she was born.
Jennifer looks at him and says,
You what?
Malcolm gives Jedediah a look that says, Don't say nothing. He decides to tell a half-truth and says,
That dream I told you about in the truck, that wasn't the full truth. I was badly hurt. My dad hit you with the car, and you kept dying over and over again. I didn't know who you were, but I couldn't live with that because my stupidity, so I kept going back until I stopped it from happening.
Rod Lane walks up and says,
You think she could go back and undo this world?
He looks at Loretta and Malcolm and says,
No, the truth is when 24 hours passes, she won't remember this, or how she did it. And even if she did, we agreed not to use it in a major way. Chaos theory and all that.
Rod nods and says,
I suppose that's true, still though it would be tempting.
Jedediah says to Loretta,
Thank you.
She nods, smiling. Later that night, Jedediah watches Malcolm and Loretta making a modification to Malcolm's knife and some duct tape, using Malcolm's stump to hold the knife. Jennifer walks up to Jedediah and says to him,
I hope you're not hiding anything else.
Jedediah responds,
Would you believe me if I said I'm not?
Jennifer looks at him close and says,
How did you stop me from dying? You said I kept dying. If you're gonna say that what you said out there was the whole truth, how did you stop me from dying?
He sighs and replies,
I went back and undid an action that led to my injury.
Ever use that gift again?
He looks at her, then looks behind her. She turns around, seeing him looking at Loretta, and he says,
She was the last time I used it. My mom died in a car wreck. She was never born.
And your father died instead.
Yes.
Jennifer looks him dead in the eye and says,
Does she know?
He looks at her, almost about to break down, and says,
I only told her about Mom's death. I never told her she wasn't born. She forgets every day, and depending on how much time she's got, she doesn't find out much of what I told her.
Jennifer looks down and nods and says,
I'll keep that to myself then.
And she walks away. He feels nothing but guilt. He looks up, walking away, hearing Taffeta dancing to Tipsy Daisy, spotting most of the elder class sitting around Kristen smoking cigarettes. He makes it over to where she's standing, looking at the window blocked off by wood. She speaks up.
So you're that Kruger kid?
He turns and says,
Yes.
So how was it?
How was what?
Living with a psycho.
He looks at her in anger and says,
What do you mean?
She turns to him and says,
You didn't know?
No what?
She keeps smoking and continues,
I went to school with her. They didn't try to keep her identity secret. Most people mocked her. She got into a few fights, and one kid ended up in the ER.
He looks at her and says,
Well, she must have worked it out because she was a great mom.
She smokes and says,
Maybe, honestly, I felt bad for her. The Elm Street kids target her specifically because her dad killed some of the kids on our street.
He looks at her again as she says,
My mom told me, if they hadn't taken him to court, she would have burned him to the stake.
He makes it back to Loretta and Malcolm and hears something.
Have I ever told you about my mom?
No.
She shrugs and says,
It says here in his timeline his mom was decent. What do I tell him?
Malcolm sighs, then replies.
Tell him.
She shakes her head as he says,
You both think you're being strong for each other, and the problem with acting like you have had it all together is you both are believing it.
Jedediah hears the whole thing as he says,
Maybe you both need to say how you don't. It's alright if you don't.
Jedediah thinks he should tell her about what led to his mom's death and remembers what his dad said, how he hid the pain. He starts to cry and walks away. Upstairs, Tracy starts to practice by punching the air like a boxer while listening to a rock song. As it plays out, her room door opens and a man walks in with a machete. He walks up to her and raises it above his head. She turns around and kicks him backwards. He lands on the floor when she looks at him wearing his mask. He gives her a death glare, and as he tries to get up, she kicks him in the face and runs for the door. After pulling in it, she looks to see it was locked, and as she tries to turn it, she feels a stab in her back, and as she looks down to see the tip of a blade in the front, Tracy spits blood out as Jarvis breathes deeply. Jedediah spots Reggie sitting across from Rod and saying, "Ever since the asylum escape, with Jarvis everyone either left or had invasions, leaving the doors open at night or being cut up." Rod replies,
Where did they say they were heading?
"New York, mostly. Some said to Kissel County, both claim no deadlines arrived to either of those places." Rod rubs his head as Mark walks up to him and says,
"If what this guy says is true, the gas we bring back will be the last time we have to consider moving."
An entire town at the same time to an entire new community. Kissel County community is all the way in Florida. And the community in New York has only one access because it blocked out most areas due to that virus. Is the train that leads from Oregon all the way there. And ever since that train was put there, no one has made it.
Jedediah walks up and says,
Sorry, you said Jarvis, right?
Reggie nods as he holds up the paper and says,
This one?
He reads it and says, Pam. She was a kind soul, shame he broke that night. His sister offed herself a month after that. He looks at him and says,
He wore a mask with 2 blue mask chevrons on each cheek.
How did you know that?
I saw him in the hotel we were stuck in. He brought in the Deadites, and then he snuck away. I think he's the one that's getting the town slaughtered, killing anyone that catches him and letting evils in from outside.
Rod asks,
Did you see where he went?
No, the door kept pushing and I got distracted. I think maybe he ran downstairs, but nobody saw him.
He thinks on the tunnel doors for a second, thinking that's where he was hiding as Reggie replies, You know, before you all showed up, like minutes before I found the door over here ajar. And in seconds the fear sets in all their faces as Rod replies,
Search the cabin.
And they all split up. Back with Malcolm and Loretta, the two sit down holding hands as she nods and says,
I'm gonna tell him.
She gets up, turning around to see Jarvis standing, the blood all over him, knife in hand. Malcolm turns his head to see this as the figure walks towards them. The two run out of the room. He starts slamming into the door, dropping a folded paper. In seconds, Reggie jumps on him, shouting, Tommy! He jumps into a wall, knocking Reggie off, cutting at his chest with the knife over and over, then slamming him into a boarded-up window, leaving him to bleed as he walks off. With Reggie opening his eyes to see the Deadites' forms of Grady and Leroy crawling towards him, with out of the neck stump of Grady blood shoots out, covering Reggie's face. Jedediah makes it to Tracy's room, hearing groaning from inside and blood leaking from under the door. He aims Becky and shouts,
Tracy's got something happening here.
The groans stop as the door slowly opens. He sees her sitting down, pale-skinned, and a hole through her bleeding as she turns around, smiling with bloodshot eyes, with yellow coloring the pupils.
Tracy's with the maggots now.
He cocks Becky as the lights flicker. And in seconds she's crawling on the ceiling. He aims and shoots her hand off, cocking, then shooting her face, blowing off part of her cheek. It looks at the place covered in blood and says,
We know more about time than you do.
He aims as the creature states,
Beings like us see reality better than you ever could. You ever wonder if your father took your mother's place, who took your sister's?
Who took your sisters?
He aims steady as he thinks on it and says,
Mom's alive?
The creature replies,
In a manner of speaking, would you like to know where she is?
Would you like to know where she is?
He nods as the lights flicker more, and in seconds she's floating towards him, straight up like a stiff board, shouting, Rod pushes him out of the way over to Sheila and Mark and swings at Tracy, hitting her shoulder with an axe. She claws at his good eye as he pulls back the axe, aiming for her skull, knocking her to the ground, striking her again, then aiming for her legs and arms until it stopped squirming. He stops breathing, heavily covered in blood, as in seconds the head of Tracy split almost perfectly in two. Speaks.
I had a happy ending, and you gave that up as well as the world for your mom.
He cocks his gun and blows her head off after the noise vanishes. Silence hits the room as he says,
I'm sorry.
As the smoke leaves his gun, Rod asks,
What did she mean by that?
He replies,
Look.
Smashing of glass is heard upstairs even more. The group moves with Kincaid and Joey standing by Rod, asking,
Where are the Youngbloods?
Kincaid replies, Most of them ran off to check the rest of the house. 2 of them were upstairs, and I heard smashing up there as well as Reggie screaming. Rod steps up with the axe, heading up. They see Reggie lying on the ground as Jedediah spots a knocked-in door with blood and a busted window mark. Joey and Kincaid go to block that off as Rod and Sheila go check on the unconscious Reggie. Jedediah looks in the room, seeing stuff knocked over and a trap door leading to the lower levels of the cabin. He looks down, spotting the paper Jarvis had dropped. He picks it up, seeing a bad stick figure drawing of the what looked like doctors and nurse shouting at a boy, "Dirty little beast," as he comments.
Great, so this guy is like a red dragon. He's tooth-fairying this shit.
He drops the paper as the window is finished being blocked off. Rod replies,
I got breathing.
Jedediah, about to close the door for some reason, had the instinct to look up to see the headless body of Grady. Looking at him, he could swear he heard laughing as he slammed the door. He turned over to see Leroy standing in the dark of the room next to Kincaid, Mark, and Joey. He then in seconds pieces together that Reggie isn't what's on the floor. In seconds, the door is slammed from behind him as he holds it, shouting,
Get away from him!
Rod turns over as Reggie's eyes open, yellow coloring them. He slams Sheila into a wall, then claws at Rod's face. Then Leroy knocks back Mark and Joey, then getting into a fist fight with Kincaid. After seconds of clawing at Rod, everyone heard a snap and turned to see Rod fall dead. As Reggie turns over at Jedediah to hear the fellow Deadites shout, Let me out! The new member of this band walks over as Jedediah flattens his back, shooting at Reggie's shoulder, blowing his arm off, then his knee. Then Sheila takes the axe, cutting what was left of him. Lastly, she cried as she could not take the risk with Rod. She chopped him into pieces to prevent him from turning whole. That was happening. Jedediah aims Becky at Kincaid's problem. He shouts at the man, Duck! He drops down and Jedediah aims to blow the Deadite back, and Sheila chops Leroy into pieces as well. The 5 upstairs breathe a sigh of relief until they remember that Grady is still in the bedroom. Jedediah turns around, putting his hand on the knob, then quickly opens it as Sheila and Kincaid charge in, but both. It was only after a second Jedediah remembered the trap door, and he looked in and hurried past the others to follow the beast. Downstairs with Jennifer, holding her pistol beside Kristen holding a machete, and the rest of the young bloods behind, they stop hearing crawling from the ceiling. They look up to see the headless beast crawling at them. Taffeta screams out as the 2 ahead fire. Jedediah hears the screaming, about to follow, but then he can hear struggling to his left. He turns to see a hall leading to a room with the light on. With grunting, he stops, spotting a knife. Inside the room, Loretta is knocked into a wall by Jarvis as Malcolm slashes at his hand, only for him to grab the stump, twisting it around his back, pressing the knife to his head as Loretta pleads,
Don't, please.
Jarvis breathes heavily, ready to stab, but then the door is knocked down and Jedediah aims Becky, only for Jarvis to press harder. Jedediah drops the gun as Jarvis gives a look of pure evil as Jedediah remembers the drawing, his look changing from horror to annoyance and rage.
Look at you. I've never seen a man as pathetic as you. You lost a fight 2-1 to this old freak? How dare you?
Malcolm looks confused and terrified until Jedediah says,
You dirty little beast.
As he feels the knife not pressing as hard and Jarvis's hands start to shake on his stump as Jedediah looks at Loretta.
You chose this? A man who can't fight?
She starts to cry as he shouts.
Don't cry at me, you little shit!
Jarvis's hand gets looser.
Say I'm sorry, Jedediah. I'm dating a dirty little beast. I'm a freak.
She replies.
No.
Say it!
Jarvis's eyes fuel with rage as his hand loosens more.
Say it or I'll kill him myself.
Jarvis's head starts to shake as he breathes heavily.
I'm dating a dirty little beast. I'm a freak, and no one will ever love me.
Jarvis throws Malcolm aside, rushes Jedediah into the wall as he tells the two.
Run! Get upstairs!
The two leave the room as Jarvis slashes at Jedediah's chest with the knife. He quickly pulls out the knife in his pocket, stabbing him in the leg as Jarvis screams. He leaves the room, grabbing Becky to run down the hallway towards where the screaming was coming from. He makes it to the door, seeing Jennifer and Tim being knocked against the wall while Dean and Kristen grab at that thing's arms. He turns around, seeing Jarvis rushing at him with machete in hand. He kneels down, aims Becky, shooting him in the shoulder. Then he slams into the door. After the second slam, Jarvis gets back into focus, looking at Jedediah, then charges as he breaks down the door. The Deadite tosses Dean and Kristen off, turning around, spotting Jarvis, and jumps at him, and as it attacks, he quickly runs into the door and shuts it behind him. After breathing for a second, he looks up, seeing them all look in terror. He was about to ask why, but then it dawned on him that all he could hear was slashing at flesh. Then in seconds, footsteps walking away. He turned around, seeing the Deadite chopped to bits. Jarvis nowhere to be found. He quickly grabs the door and pulls it open, running in. Spotting Jarvis walking after Malcolm and Loretta, he spots a window on the stairwell and aims, shooting at it, busting it wide open. Then he drops the gun and runs at Jarvis and pushes him out, seeing him fall into a pit outside. After a second to think, he can hear the Deadite noises getting louder, and he shouts,
Everyone upstairs!
And in a hurry, everyone left gets up through the trap door. Jedediah being last, he closes the door, putting something heavy on it, keeping the beasts out.